The girl on the corner. The city of New York never slept. Even as the sky turned a deep shade of blue and the streetlights flickered to life one by one, the city pulsed with energy. Taxis weaved between lanes with blaring horns. Street performers strummed guitars and banged drums on sidewalks. The glow of neon signs bounced off buildings and puddles alike. People moved quickly, faces buried in their phones, lost in thought, or just rushing to be somewhere. But on the corner of 46th Street and Broadway, amidst the glitter and noise, stood a little girl who didn't quite fit the scene. She was no more than 9 years old, wrapped in a too-large hoodie and a scarf that fluttered like a flag in the chilly autumn wind. The oversized sleeves nearly swallowed her tiny hands, and her shoes had thin soles worn almost to holes. Still, she stood proudly, with a plastic basket looped around her arm. Inside it were hand-knitted hats, some red, some blue, some striped with mismatched yarn. Each one carried love, and every stitch told a quiet story of hope. Her name was Sophie, and tonight, she was trying to help her mother in the only way she could. Handmade hats, just $5. Sophie called out, her voice sweet and hopeful, but easily swallowed by the noise around her. People passed by in waves. Some gave her a smile or a sympathetic glance, but most didn't even notice her. Some pulled their coats tighter. Others looked down at their phones or turned away, not out of cruelty, but because life in the city had taught them to keep moving. She had been out for almost an hour. Not a single hat had been sold. A glimpse into her life. Sophie and her mom, Carla, lived in a tiny apartment in Queens. It had only one bedroom, a rusty old heater that barely worked, and a leaky faucet that played an off-key tune every night. But it was home. Carla worked harder than anyone Sophie knew. She waited tables at a small diner in the mornings, and at night she scrubbed office buildings downtown. On weekends, when she had just a few hours between jobs, she sat by the window and knitted hats, each loop and thread a way of saying, "I love you," even when she couldn't be there. Sometimes, Sophie would sit next to her, pretending to knit, even though she always tangled the yarn. Their life was hard. Bills stacked up faster than Carla could pay them. Sophie rarely had new clothes. Her school lunch was often just peanut butter and jelly. But they had each other, and that mattered more than anything. The stranger in the crowd. Sophie was about to pack up. Her fingers were stiff from the cold, and her stomach rumbled softly. She bent down to adjust the hats, whispering to them like they were her friends. And then he appeared. At first, Sophie didn't notice him. He was just another tall man in a black coat, moving through the crowd. But something made him pause. He looked at her, not past her, not through her, but right at her. His face was familiar, though he wore a baseball cap pulled low over his brow. He crouched down so his eyes were level with hers. "Did you make these?" he asked gently. Sophie shook her head. "My mom did. I just sell them." He smiled. "They're really nice." Then she looked up fully and gasped. "You're," she began, eyes wide. He quickly held a finger to his lips and winked. "Let's keep that a secret, okay?" he whispered. It was Keanu Reeves. She had only seen him once in a movie that played on a friend's tablet at school. Some action thing where he rode a horse and chased bad guys. But here he was, real and kind and crouching on a cold sidewalk, talking to her. A small act of kindness. Keanu picked up a red hat with little ear flaps. "I like this one." "How much?" $5, Sophie said, almost breathless. He reached into his wallet and pulled out a crisp $100 bill. Her eyes grew huge. I don't have change for that." He shook his head and smiled. "I don't need change. It's a tip. For great craftsmanship." Sophie clutched the bill like it might fly away. She blinked fast, trying not to cry. "Thank you. Thank you so much." Keanu placed the red hat on his head and gave her a thumbs up. "Fits perfectly." And then, just as he turned to leave, Sophie did something unexpected. "Wait," she called out. "You can't go without this." She reached into the basket and pulled out her own hat, a faded blue one with a frayed edge and a small stitched heart near the rim. "It's not for sale," she said, "but I want you to have it. It's my favorite." Keanu turned back, surprised. "You sure?" he asked. She nodded. "It's lucky. And you're really nice. So, I want you to have it." He knelt again and accepted the hat like it was the crown of a king. Then, instead of putting it on, he folded it carefully and tucked it inside his coat pocket, close to his heart. "Thank you, Sophie," he said softly. "This means more than you know. Something bigger than a hat." Sophie watched him walk away, her heart filled with something she hadn't felt in a long time. Hope. She didn't know that he would return the next day. She didn't know that everything in her life was about to change. And she definitely didn't know that a simple gesture, a hat from the heart, was about to start a chain of events that would touch millions. But for now, she just stood on the street corner with her basket, under the buzzing glow of New York City lights, and smiled. The return of the stranger. The sun rose over New York with its usual golden stubbornness, spilling light through the cracks of tenement windows and dancing across the chipped walls of worn-out apartments. In a small one-bedroom unit tucked inside an aging building in Queens, Sophia Knight stirred awake to the rhythmic clank of the radiator trying to do its job. She rubbed her eyes, the memory of the night before flashing vividly in her mind. The way the man in the black coat had smiled, the warmth in his voice, the way he had taken her favorite hat and tucked it into his coat like it was the most valuable thing he owned. It hadn't just been any man. It had been Keanu Reeves. But even now, lying on the lumpy mattress beside her sleeping mother, Sophie still wondered if it had really happened, or if her imagination had played tricks on her again, as it sometimes did when things felt too good to be true. On the kitchen table sat the $100 bill, untouched. She hadn't told her mom yet. Carla had come home late from cleaning an office building downtown, so tired she hadn't even taken off her shoes before falling asleep. Sophie had just kissed her cheek, tucked a blanket over her shoulders, and climbed into bed next to her. The morning chill made her shiver, but it didn't bother her much. Today felt different. Whispers in the neighborhood. By the time Sophie got dressed and made her way to the bodega downstairs to grab a loaf of bread and some eggs, the streets were buzzing, not with the usual gossip, but with something more curious. "You hear he was in the city last night?" "Swear on my life, I saw him near Times Square. With a kid. He was wearing some scruffy red hat. Could have sworn I've seen that style before." Sophie's ears perked up. She gripped the brown paper bag tighter as she walked past the group of neighbors chatting outside the laundromat. She didn't stop. Not yet. But her heart beat a little faster. Back upstairs, Carla was already up and making coffee. "You were out late yesterday," she said softly, her voice hoarse from exhaustion. "Any luck with the hats?" Sophie hesitated. "Just a little," she said, handing over the groceries and slipping the folded bill onto the table like it was a feather. Carla unfolded it and nearly dropped the eggs. "Where did you?" "A man bought a hat," Sophie said quietly. "And he liked it a lot." A knock at the door. By midday, Sophie sat by the window with her homework spread across the table. Carla had already gone to her first job, leaving behind a sandwich and a kiss on the forehead. Outside, the streets bustled as usual. Delivery trucks, barking dogs, distant car alarms. Sophie had just finished solving a long division problem when the sound of a knock echoed through the apartment. She jumped up. They rarely had visitors. The landlord came once a month, and sometimes the nosy neighbor from down the hall stopped by to borrow sugar. But today felt different. She padded softly across the floor and peeked through the peephole. There he was, Keanu Reeves, standing in the hallway of her building, holding a small white bag, his red knitted hat perched casually on his head like it belonged there. Sophie's jaw dropped. She quickly unlatched the lock and pulled the door open. "How's your mom?" he asked. "Working," Sophie said. She's always working. Keanu nodded. She's a strong woman. You're lucky to have her. I know, Sophie said, looking down. But sometimes I wish she didn't have to work so hard. There was a long pause. Keanu looked at her with soft eyes. Not the kind of look that pitied, but the kind that understood. I was raised by a single mom too, he said. She worked a lot, and there were days when we barely had enough. Sophie looked up in surprise. You? He smiled again. Yeah, me. We lived in small apartments. Moved a lot. But my mom, she made sure I never gave up. More than a visit. Keanu finished his soup and stood up, brushing crumbs from his lap. I've been thinking, he said, about last night, about you, and that hat. Sophie tilted her head. I told a few friends about it, he said. And one of them had an idea. Would it be okay if we did something together? You and your mom. Something nice. Maybe come to a set. See how movies are made. Sophie's eyes grew wide. Really? Really? But she looked around at their small apartment. We don't have anything nice to wear. Keanu knelt again. You don't need anything fancy. You already gave the world something priceless. Sophie smiled, and for the first time in months, her eyes shimmered not from sadness, but from joy. Meanwhile, on social media, unbeknownst to Sophie, Keanu's short walk from Times Square to his hotel the night before had been captured by a tourist from Kansas. The woman had posted a photo online with the caption, Keanu Reeves just bought a hat from a little girl on the corner, gave her $100, and walked off like a legend. NYC magic. The post had exploded overnight. Within 12 hours, it had gone viral across platforms. People were sharing it with captions like, Keanu always proving he's one of the good ones. We need more of this energy in the world. Anyone know who that little girl is? Someone find her. By afternoon, news outlets were trying to confirm the story. And by evening, Sophie's life was no longer just her own. The beginning of a miracle. As the sun dipped below the skyline, casting long shadows on the city that never sleeps, Sophie sat curled on the couch, her heart full. Outside, her building was just another one of 1,000, blending into the city's maze. But inside, a spark had been lit, and little did she know, tomorrow, the world would come looking for the girl who gave away her hat. When the world found Sophie, morning in New York was rarely quiet. But for Sophianite, the third morning after giving away her favorite hat started not with the usual noise of distant horns or the rumble of the subway, but with the sound of someone knocking, again. Not the polite kind of knock either. This was different. Tap, 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 tap. Sophie jolted upright on the couch, still wrapped in the faded patchwork blanket her mother had made years ago. The TV was on, playing old cartoons on low volume. The apartment smelled like oatmeal and cinnamon toast, leftovers from the breakfast Carla had made before leaving for her diner shift. Sophie's feet hit the cold floor as she hurried to the door. The last time someone knocked like this, it had been the landlord reminding them rent was late. Her chest tightened. But when she looked through the peephole, her jaw dropped. There were people outside. Lots of them. Cameras. Microphones. Reporters. A woman in a sharp suit holding a clipboard. A man in sunglasses talking into a walkie-talkie. And beyond them, on the sidewalk, a black SUV idled with its hazard lights blinking. Sophie's fingers trembled on the doorknob. The girl from the sidewalk. Sophianite, asked the woman with the clipboard, her voice cheerful and urgent. Good morning. I'm Leela with Channel 7 News. We were hoping we could talk to you about a certain red hat and a certain kind-hearted actor. Sophie blinked. Wait, what? The woman laughed warmly. Sweetie, you're all over the internet. You and Keanu Reeves broke the hearts of half the country. Before Sophie could reply, the camera lights flared, and she instinctively stepped back. But Leela reached out gently. We won't do anything you're not okay with. But would you be willing to tell us your story? Sophie swallowed hard. Across the city and the world, what had started with a single viral post had exploded into a global movement. In London, people tweeted about the hat girl with the golden heart. In Tokyo, a morning show ran a segment titled, "The Child Who Touched a Movie Star." In Kenya, a radio host spoke tearfully about generosity in small packages. In Paris, a bakery began selling Sophie's sweet buns, with 100% of proceeds going to single mothers in need. Hashtag Sophie and Keanu was trending across all platforms. Even people who had never watched a Keanu Reeves movie were captivated by the simplicity of it all. A girl with nothing gives everything. A man with everything gives back. At the diner, Carla stood behind the counter at the diner on 3rd Avenue, refilling coffee for the regulars, when her co-worker Maria ran up waving a phone. Carla, look. On the tiny screen was a news anchor standing outside their apartment building. The chyron read, EXTLUSIV. The little girl who melted Keanu Reeves' heart. Carla nearly dropped the coffee pot. The video rolled. There was Sophie, standing shyly next to a reporter, telling her story with a voice so full of innocence and quiet pride. Carla covered her mouth with her hand. Oh, my baby. Meanwhile, at a different corner of New York, Keanu Reeves sat at a long wooden table in a quiet community center, across from a nonprofit director named Denise. Between them was a pile of folders, each filled with photos of kids and families struggling across the city. I didn't expect this, Keanu said, rubbing the back of his neck. It was just a hat. Denise smiled. It was more than a hat. It was the story behind it, the simplicity, the humanity. He looked down at a folder with Sophie's name on it. Tell me what we can do, he said. A new door opens. Back at the apartment, Sophie sat on the couch once again, surrounded by boxes. Not of hats, but of gifts. Books, toys, warm clothes, letters from strangers. Some were from students in Nebraska, others from artists in Seoul. There was even one letter written in calligraphy from an elderly woman in Italy. You gave away something that mattered to you. That is what real wealth looks like. Sophie looked around, overwhelmed. Mom's going to freak out, she whispered. A moment later, her phone buzzed. It was a text from an unfamiliar number. Hi, Sophie. It's Keanu. Mind if I stop by again? I have something to ask you. Her heart skipped a beat. The proposal. When Keanu arrived, he wasn't alone this time. He was with a small crew from a production company and a woman named Allison, who explained she was a documentary producer. We're not here to invade your space, she said gently, looking around the small apartment. We want to create something that celebrates kindness, that shows people how a small act can change the world. And we think it should begin with you. Sophie stared. You want me in a movie? Keanu knelt beside her again, just like he did on that first night. Not a movie, he said. A true story. Yours. He pulled something from his coat pocket. Her blue hat, now preserved inside a clear protective case. We want this to be the first image people see, he said. The symbol of how one small girl made the world stop and remember what kindness looks like. Sophie's decision. That night, after the visitors left and the apartment quieted down again, Sophie and her mom sat at the little table with the flickering bulb overhead. Carla looked at her daughter with eyes full of emotion. You've always had a big heart, she whispered. Now the whole world gets to see it. But do you think I'm ready? Sophie asked softly. Carla reached across the table and held her daughter's hand. You were ready the moment you gave away that hat. And somewhere far away, in a dusty village in another country, a little girl with no shoes and a cracked smartphone watched Sophie's video in a crowded schoolroom. She turned to her teacher and said, I want to be like her. Her teacher smiled and replied, You already are. The girl with the hat becomes a voice for millions. The following days felt like a dream made of bright lights and loud applause. But dreams, Sophie quickly learned, weren't always soft and easy. The new world outside. From the moment Sophie stepped outside her apartment building, nothing was the same. People on the street now stopped her to take photos. Children ran up with crayons and asked for her autograph. Strangers gave her flowers and candy, notes that read, "You made me cry and smile" at the same time. Camera crews parked outside the building in shifts. Carla had to talk to the landlord about letting reporters in. And one morning, someone even painted a mural of Sophie on the side of the bodega down the block, her holding the red hat, smiling up at the sky. The words painted beneath it said, "One hat, one heart, one hero." TV studios and talk shows. On a cold Thursday morning, a sleek black car pulled up outside their apartment to take Sophie and Carla to their very first television interview. Inside the studio, everything was buzzing, lights flashing, assistants hurrying, people adjusting microphones. Sophie sat in the green room in awe, her knees bouncing with nervous energy. Her mother sat beside her, gently braiding her hair and whispering words of encouragement. "You don't have to say anything perfect," Carla said. "Just speak with your heart." When the cameras rolled and the host smiled at her across the desk, Sophie remembered those words. "Why did you give him the hat?" The host leaned in. "Sophie, you were standing on a busy New York street, selling handmade hats. You'd had no luck. And then a man stops, buys one, and gives you a very generous tip. And even though you needed that money, you gave him something extra. Why?" Sophie looked at the camera, then at the audience, then back down at her little hands resting in her lap. Her voice was soft, but steady. "Because no one's ever looked at me like I mattered before," she said. "Not like that. He made me feel seen. And I just wanted to give something back." There was a silence in the studio. Not even the cameras clicked. Then a slow clap, then more, until the entire crowd stood on their feet. Carla wiped a tear. The host reached across the desk and gently held Sophie's hand. "You may not know this," she said, "but you've changed a lot of lives." Messages from around the globe. Back at home that evening, Carla's old phone buzzed nonstop with messages. There were emails, video messages, drawings from school children around the world. One little boy from Brazil had drawn Sophie as a superhero wearing a cape made of yarn. A teenage girl from India had sent a voice note. "I wanted to give up, but I saw your story, and I didn't. Thank you." A firefighter in Australia wrote, "That red hat, it reminded me of the day someone saved my daughter's life. Never stop being who you are." Sophie didn't understand it all. She was still a child. But with every word she read or heard, something grew inside her, something bold and warm and powerful. Meeting the mayor. Later that week, Sophie and Carla were invited to City Hall. The mayor himself stood in front of a crowd of journalists, grinning proudly beside Sophie as she wore her second favorite hat, a bright purple one her mother had made the year before. "We gather here," the mayor said, "to honor a young citizen who reminded us of something we too often forget in this city: compassion. And we are officially declaring the 23rd of this month as Sophia Night Day in New York City." Cheers echoed through the grand hall. Carla clapped with her hands trembling. Sophie blinked under the flash of 100 cameras. And Keanu? He stood off to the side, arms folded, smiling in quiet pride, his red hat still on his head, like a symbol he wore not for show, but for remembrance. An offer she didn't expect. After the ceremony, Keanu pulled Sophie and Carla aside. "I've been thinking," he said. "A lot of people are asking me what I plan to do next, and I keep telling them, it's not about me. It's about her." Sophie looked up. "What do you mean?" "I want to fund a project," Keanu said. "In your name. A nonprofit. Something your mother and I discussed. A place where kids like you, kids with big hearts and hard lives, can get the support they need. Warm clothes, homework help, Even just a safe space to breathe. Sophie's eyes widened. Like a center. He nodded. Yes, and we'll call it the Hat Project, after the one thing that started all of this. Carla looked overwhelmed. I don't know what to say, she whispered. Keanu looked between them. You already said it, he replied. With love. With sacrifice. With a hat. When Sophie got the mic, at the launch event for the Hat Project, reporters, celebrities, and local families gathered in a renovated building that used to be an abandoned library. Now it had bookshelves, art walls, beanbags, and a knitting room for parents who needed quiet time. As the cameras rolled, Sophie was asked to say a few words. She stepped up to the podium, barely tall enough to see over it, and held her note cards, though she didn't need them. She took a deep breath. Everyone tells me I changed the world, she said. But I didn't. I just gave away a hat. It wasn't even new. It was old and kind of itchy, but it meant something to me. She paused. I gave it because someone made me feel seen. I think maybe what the world needs most isn't money or fame or even comfort. Maybe it just needs more people seeing each other. For real. Applause. Tears. Smiles. And from the back of the room, Keanu Reeves clapped louder than anyone else. One more surprise. After the ceremony, Keanu approached Sophie and Carla with a shy grin. There's one more thing, he said. I know your lease is ending soon. Carla's face tensed. We've been trying to figure it out. You don't have to, he interrupted. I bought you a new apartment. 2 bedrooms. Heat that works. Close to a school Sophie will love. And it's already paid off. Sophie gasped. Carla blinked fast, tears already spilling over. I can't accept. Yes, Keanu said gently. You can. Because sometimes we all need help, and because a girl gave me her lucky hat and reminded me how important it is to show up for each other. A quiet evening after the storm. That night, in the new apartment, Sophie sat on her bed under a soft comforter, holding her blue hat in her lap. It had been cleaned, repaired, and restored. The little heart stitched at the brim was still there. Still hers. Carla peeked in from the doorway. Can you believe any of this is real? She asked. Sophie smiled. It's not a dream. It's just kindness coming back around. Carla walked in, kissed her daughter's forehead, and turned out the light. Outside, New York hummed on, loud and fast and full of noise. But inside that room, there was peace. A ripple in the world. The world had seen viral stories before. A flash of emotion. A trending hashtag. A few days of media frenzy before attention drifted somewhere new. But Sophie and Knight's story didn't fade. Because Sophie wasn't a story. She was real. And she wasn't done yet. From one spark, a fire. Weeks passed, but the warmth from Sophie's gesture continued to glow brighter. Every day, new letters arrived at the office of the Hat Project, now up and running with volunteers, mentors, and warm food in the evenings. But it wasn't just letters. Entire schools started hat drives, collecting hand-knitted caps for children in shelters. Senior centers began teaching young people how to sew and knit, connecting generations that rarely talked. Artists from around the world began sending in custom artwork of Sophie, her mother, and Keanu, the 3 hearts that had reminded the world what kindness could look like. At the center of it all, Sophie remained. Sophie, still soft-spoken, still humble, still a 9-year-old girl who liked coloring and chocolate milk. But something inside her had changed. She was no longer just giving out hats. She was giving people a reason to care again. An invitation from afar. One cold afternoon, Sophie and Carla sat in the cozy reading room of the new apartment, sipping hot cocoa and laughing over an old board game when the phone rang. Carla picked up and froze. It's for you, she whispered, her hand trembling. Sophie held the phone to her ear. A calm, graceful voice spoke. Hello, Sophie. My name is First Lady Celeste Okafor. I am calling from the United Nations Children's Forum. Sophie blinked. The First Lady continued. We've been watching your journey. We believe your message, your heart, belongs on a much larger stage. Would you consider coming to Geneva to speak on behalf of children around the world who feel invisible? There was a long silence. Then Sophie whispered, "Yes, I'd be honored." The trip of a lifetime. The flight to Geneva, Switzerland was Sophie's first time on an airplane. Carla held her hand the entire way. Keanu, who had insisted on coming quietly along to support her, sat across the aisle in sunglasses and a baseball cap, trying to stay invisible and failing. The flight attendants recognized him instantly. But Sophie? They greeted her with tears in their eyes and gave her a small bouquet of flowers tied with yarn. "You're the girl with the hat," one whispered. "You reminded us why we wanted to help people in the first place." The global stage. The United Nations Hall in Geneva was grand and cold and intimidating, rows upon rows of world leaders, translators, delegates, and press. Sophie stood backstage in a pale blue dress and matching cardigan, nervously gripping a tiny note card. "You don't have to be anyone but yourself," Keanu said softly, kneeling beside her. Just like that day on the sidewalk. Carla kissed the top of her head. And then they called her name. Sophia Knight, founder of the Hat Project and global ambassador of kindness. As she stepped onto the massive stage, the lights almost blinded her, but she didn't look away. Sophie's speech to the world. She approached the podium, tiny hands resting on the edge, her voice nervous but steady. "I'm not a leader," she began. "I'm not famous. I don't know big words. I'm just a girl from New York who gave away her hat." The audience leaned in, and I didn't do it to go viral. I didn't even know who the man was. I just saw someone who looked tired, someone who smiled at me like I mattered. She paused, remembering that night. I gave him my hat because it was mine. It was all I had to give. But what I got back was this. She turned and motioned to the crowd, to the stage, to the world watching. I didn't fix poverty. I didn't save lives. But I reminded people that we all have something to give. And that matters. As she finished, there was silence, then a standing ovation. World leaders, translators, journalists, delegates, everyone stood. Not for a politician, not for a policy, but for a little girl with a blue hat and a giant heart. Back at home, reactions across the globe. In a village in Bangladesh, a classroom clapped as they watched Sophie's speech on a cracked projector screen. In Canada, a knitting club tripled in size, rebranding themselves Hats Across Hearts. In Brazil, a boy named Diego, whose mother was in the hospital, started selling handmade bracelets to raise money for other kids in need. And in Los Angeles, a studio executive who had long since forgotten the power of storytelling sent an email with the subject line, "We don't need another superhero movie. We need this story." Sophie faces a question. A few days after returning from Geneva, Sophie sat on a bench in Central Park, bundled in a thick red coat and sipping warm apple cider. Keanu sat beside her, people watching in peaceful silence. "You did something incredible," he finally said. "I was scared," Sophie whispered. "Still am." "That means you were brave." She nodded. "I don't want it to be about me," she said. "I want other kids to feel like they matter too." He turned to her and asked gently, "So what are you going to do next?" What came next? Sophie didn't start a business. She didn't run for office. She didn't let adults write her speeches. Instead, she wrote letters, hundreds of them, to kids who sent her their own hats, to mothers struggling to make ends meet, to children in war zones who said they had no more hope. And to each one, she wrote a version of the same message. You are seen. You matter. You're not forgotten. The promise of a generation. As the seasons changed and winter painted the city in snow and silver, Sophie's story continued to echo, not just in headlines or murals, but in human hearts. She had become more than the girl who gave away her hat. She had become a symbol of light in a world that too often forgets to look for it. And from that day forward, every hat that was handed out in her name carried a small tag. Inspired by Sophie. Made with heart. Given with hope. The quiet storm within. Sophia Knight had given the world a new language, one built not of words, but of gestures. A hat, knitted with love. A smile, shared with sincerity. A moment where someone felt seen. The movement she sparked was no longer just viral. It was visceral, real, and still growing. But as the world clapped louder for her, Sophie began to notice something quieter and heavier, right at home. A mother's fatigue. One evening, just a few weeks after returning from Geneva, Sophie walked into the apartment and found her mother, Carla, sitting at the kitchen table. Her elbows rested on the surface, her hands buried in her hair. She hadn't even heard Sophie come in. There were no reporters, no stage lights. Just a broken woman staring at a stack of unpaid medical bills. "Mom?" Sophie asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Carla looked up with tired eyes and tried to force a smile, but it didn't reach. Sophie walked over and wrapped her arms around her mother's waist, pressing her cheek into Carla's side. "I thought everything was better now," Sophie said softly. "Why are you still so tired?" Carla's breath caught in her throat. Her fingers gently combed through Sophie's hair. "Because when you've carried a mountain for years," she whispered, "it takes time to believe you're allowed to put it down." A hidden past. That night, Carla told Sophie a story she'd never heard before. When Carla was 17, she was accepted into a performing arts school for vocal music. She had dreams of becoming a singer, but when Carla's mother fell ill, she dropped everything to care for her younger siblings. After that, life kept pulling her away from music, one setback after another. Jobs, bills, survival. Then came Sophie. And nothing else mattered but making sure her little girl had a chance. "I never stopped singing," Carla said. "I just stopped being heard." Sophie looked up at her. "Then maybe it's time someone hears you again." The gift that changed everything. The next morning, Sophie snuck into the office of the Hat Project with a folded piece of paper. She handed it to the director, a woman named Maya, who smiled as she read the note. "My mom gave up everything for me, but she's the reason I believe in hope. I want to give something back to her now. Could we help her sing again?" An unforgettable night. 2 weeks later, Carla stood on a small stage inside a newly renovated community theater, nervously holding a microphone. She had no idea the crowd that had gathered, or that Keanu himself had rented out the entire venue for one night, or that Sophie had personally invited some of the top vocal coaches in the city. All Carla knew was that her daughter was sitting front row, beaming with pride. The lights dimmed. The piano began, and then Carla sang. Her voice, warm, full, raw, rose into the room like sunlight through stained glass. It wasn't perfect, but it was honest, and it made people weep. By the time she finished, the entire room stood in a hushed silence, then broke into thunderous applause. Sophie ran onto the stage and hugged her mother tight. "You didn't stop being heard," she whispered. "The world just forgot to listen." The return of a father. That same week, something unexpected happened. A man in a dusty jacket, holding a crumpled newspaper with Sophie's photo on the front, walked into the Hat Project office. His name was Miguel Anite. He was Sophie's father. He had left years ago when Sophie was still in diapers, burdened by addiction, shame, and a fear of never being enough. He had spent the last few years sober, working odd jobs, moving from city to city, but never reaching out, because he believed his family was better off without him. Until he saw the story. Until he saw her. The director called Carla and Sophie in. The reunion was cautious, delicate, emotional. Sophie stared at him for a long time, then walked up and said quietly, "Are you the reason I like old country music?" Miguel laughed through tears. Yeah, that's me. They talked for hours. No blame. No bitterness. Sophie didn't see a man who left. She saw a man trying to return. Healing comes in pieces. Reuniting didn't fix everything. Carla was guarded. Miguel was awkward. Sophie had questions. But healing, they realized, didn't come with a headline. It came with time, with effort, with small, brave steps. So they started simple. Coffee at a park bench. Old photos laid out on a table. Stories of who they were and who they were trying to be now. Eventually, Miguel began volunteering at the Hat Project, teaching other fathers how to sew and reconnect with their children. And slowly, the family that had once shattered began finding their pieces again. The movement evolves. Inspired by Sophie's forgiveness and Carla's voice, the Hat Project began expanding. New programs launched. Stitch and Heal, a free workshop for parents rebuilding broken bonds with their children. Sing It Forward, a platform for mothers with untold dreams to perform and share their talents. Letters from Sophie, a mentorship program where kids received personal letters of encouragement. The world didn't just see Sophie as the girl with the hat anymore. They saw her as a leader with vision, a child with wisdom far beyond her years. A message from the mountains. One morning, a package arrived at the project office. Inside was a red and blue patterned poncho and a letter from a woman in Peru. My son was caught in a flood. We lost our home. But then someone gave us a hat from your project. It wasn't just warm. It was love. My son said, "Mom, I think angels live in yarn now." Sophie cried when she read it, because she finally understood something. It had never been about a single hat. It had always been about connection. A moment of reflection. One night, Sophie sat by the window in her new apartment. Snow fell gently outside, muffling the city's usual chaos. In her lap was the original blue hat, the one she'd given to Keanu, now lovingly returned. She held it close, closed her eyes, and whispered, "Thank you for changing my life." But somewhere deep inside, she realized, the hat didn't change her life. She did. She made the choice to give. She made the choice to believe. She made the choice to forgive. And those choices were still changing the world, one stitch at a time. The threads that never break. 10 years had passed. New York was still loud and restless, alive with yellow taxis, impatient crosswalk signals, and windows glowing from towering apartments above. But on the corner of 46th Street and Broadway, where a little girl once stood shivering beside a basket of hand-knitted hats, something new had risen. A statue, not of marble or bronze, but of woven steel strands, shaped like yarn in motion. Looping, spiraling, forming a young girl holding out a single knitted hat with both hands. Beneath it, a plaque read, "The world wasn't changed by a billionaire. It was changed by a girl who gave what she could." In loving memory of Sophie Anite, the light that stayed behind. Sophie had lived a full life, not long in years, but eternal in impact. After her story touched millions, she had chosen to stay grounded. She never wanted riches or fame. She simply wanted to keep building kindness, quietly, humbly, like her mother taught her. She ran the Hat Project with her mom, Carla, and later with her dad, Miguel, who had stayed sober and rebuilt his role as a father. Sophie went on to speak at schools, hospitals, and even prisons. She wrote 3 children's books. She never stopped writing personal letters to kids around the world, hundreds every year. And she never stopped wearing hand-knitted hats. But one winter, just after her 19th birthday, Sophie fell ill. It was fast. It was unexpected. And despite the best care, the world lost her far too soon. But Sophie wasn't really gone. She had left a pattern, a way of living stitched into the lives of those she touched. Carla's promise. After Sophie's passing, Carla was devastated, but not broken. She remembered how Sophie once told her, "When I'm gone, don't let the story end with me. Make it bigger. make it brighter. So that's what Carla did. She expanded the hat project into 23 cities, from Harlem to Nairobi to villages in the Philippines. Each location carried the same mission: to give children warmth, safety, and someone who saw them. She also launched the Sophie Fellowship, a yearly grant for children between 7 and 17 with community-changing ideas. The first winner was a 10-year-old refugee girl who wanted to build solar lanterns for kids in camps so they could study at night. When asked what inspired her, the girl said, "Sophie showed me that even small hands can hold big hope." Keanu's reflection. Keanu Reeves rarely spoke to the media, but every year, on the anniversary of their first meeting, he released a private letter to be read during Sophie's memorial livestream. On the 10th anniversary, this was his message. "She thought she was just a kid with a hat, but she gave me more than warmth. She gave me clarity. She reminded me why I ever picked up a camera, why I ever chased meaning in stories. Because the real heroes don't wear capes. They stand in the cold and still choose to give." He later donated the original blue hat to a museum in New York's Museum of Kindness, a new institution born out of Sophie's global wave of good. It sits under glass, beside her red coat and her first pair of boots, labeled, "The Hat That Started a Movement." The letter found in her journal. Carla once said she could never open Sophie's old journal until one summer night when the world felt still enough to carry the weight. Inside it, she found a folded letter, unfinished, handwritten, addressed, "To my future self, or anyone who finds this." It read, "If you're reading this, it means you're still here. That's a gift. People will tell you that kindness is weakness. It isn't. It's courage. They'll say one person can't change the world. They're wrong. You won't always see the ripples you make, but make them anyway. Don't wait to have more. Give what you can when you can. And if you ever feel small, remember, I was just a kid with a hat." Sophie, the new girl on the corner. It was winter again. Snowflakes spun down from the sky like feathers. The city hustled around itself, too busy to notice the little moments. Almost. But there, at the same corner where Sophie once stood, now stood a young girl with long braids, holding a basket of her own. Her name was Amira, a 10-year-old who had read Sophie's story 1,000 times. Inside her basket were scarves, not hats, each one tagged with a quote from Sophie's journal. As people passed, Amira called out gently, "Warm scarves for those who believe kindness still matters." Most people smiled. Some ignored her. But one woman stopped, tears already in her eyes. She picked up a scarf, read the tag, and said, "You know, I once met Sophie a night." Amira's eyes sparkled. "Really?" The woman nodded. "And I see her in you." Legacy in motion. Sophie's story didn't end in a viral post. It didn't end in applause or awards or even in tragedy. It continued, in every stitch made with love, in every kind word spoken when it wasn't required, in every child who believed they mattered because someone finally told them so. And on chilly nights in New York, when the wind cuts through the streets and people rush past each other, if you listen closely, you might hear the echo of a small voice calling out through the snow. Handmade hats, just $5. But now, everyone is listening.